Perfect.
You guys have at it.
Thank you.
And there's beverages. Feel like, you can get up. They won't be offended if you get up and get beverages. And I'm going to stand out there a little bit and see if anybody comes. You guys start.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much, Peg. So yeah, I'm Jen Westmoreland Bouchard, lifelong member of this community. I have the honor of serving on the Hopkins School Board, representing all of you to our district. And I'm a faculty member at Normandale Community College, where I teach between, see, there's the feedback you wanted, Lee.
There's always feedback.
I teach between the World Languages and Cultures and English departments. I manage our campus-wide internationalization work and do a lot of social justice work, both on campus and off, around racial justice, housing justice, those types of issues. So it's such an honor to be here tonight. I think this is a perfect example of our community engagement efforts within Hopkins Schools. So I'd like to give a shout out to Dominique Pierre Toussaint, who coordinated this evening, who connected all of us, and of course to Peg for her gracious hospitality here at the Commons. I have the honor tonight of entering into conversation with Lee Hutton. So here we are, life lessons from 4 notable cases. I'll introduce Lee. We'll start off with a few questions to kind of contextualize the conversation.
Sure.
And then move into those cases. Does that sound?
That sounds like a plan.
Good, great. So with a nationwide practice, Lee's clients range from individuals to Fortune 500 companies. He's represented athletes, celebrities, and artists in contract negotiations. He also advises his clients on brand protection and extortion threats. His client list contains professional, amateur, Paralympic and Olympic athletes, entertainers, musicians, and celebrities. Lee is also currently working on a book entitled The Absence of Color, and I hope we have some time to talk about that at the end. Cool. So as Peg already kind of framed up for you, tonight Lee will discuss ethical dilemmas facing our society through his unique vantage point representing clients in 4 notable cases. We'll get into those cases in a moment. But first, I'd like to talk about your approach to your field. So when we met, we started this conversation 2 days ago, but we're glad that you're here to be a part of it now. Right. So when we started our conversation 2 days ago, you described lawyers as being cultural anthropologists, and I just found this such a compelling observation. I wonder if you could talk more about that.
Right. No, so I will put that in context of where I'm originally from. So I am from Galveston, Texas, the Republican state, the red state, which may be blue pretty soon. And just as a caveat, I will offend some of you tonight, and that means I did my job, because I'm going to force you guys to think. But in Texas, where I grew up, if you're a black, white, Mexican, you stayed in your areas. There were 2 IHOPs, and even in 1994, where I graduated, we had separate proms. We had a white prom and a black prom in 1994. And so when I came up here in Minnesota, it was a culture shock because people used the term Norwegian. I had no idea what a Norwegian was. This is true. I had no idea what a Norwegian was until everybody started saying Ole and Lena jokes, and the Norwegians didn't like the Swedes, and I'm like, what is this? So I met somebody, and he took me to an organization called Norski Torski Klubben. Are you guys familiar with that? It's an all-male Norwegian club, Sons of Norway, and I went, and when I walked in the front door, I thought it was a Klan rally, because I've never seen so many white faces that were so comfortable in greeting me. They were really nice, but they needed to learn about me just as if I was learning about them. And what I learned from them was kind of this passive-aggressive kind of nature in Minnesota. And that's not saying it in a bad way. It's just kind of the personalities of where we grew up. Where I grew up in Texas, it was okay to say what you wanted. It was okay to offend people. And if you didn't like it, you're supposed to be on your side of the street anyway. But through my relationship with the Sons of Norway, I started to hone in kind of that cultural anthropology that you've talked about. So now I'm a first-year attorney. I'm trying my first case. Nothing but white male Norwegians. completely. And I had to get each one of these individuals to recognize my theory of case for my client. And you do that by connecting with them. So my closing statement, my analogy, so if you've watched Boston Legal and Law and Order, I'm kind of that attorney that will take something that you're familiar with, make it into an analogy, and then discuss my theory of the case through that analogy. So Ole and Lena, I told jokes, and they resonated with it. Resonated with the Vikings and how the Swedes and the Norwegians don't get along, but we're all in the same boat, and accountability and credibility and Minnesota values, and I ended up winning. Now, what happens, and I bet you there's some of you that may know this and some of you that don't, how jury pools get created is on voting records. So if you don't vote, you're not going to make a jury pool in Minnesota. And in 2008, Obama was elected, and he was able to get many African Americans to vote. So now the jury pool started to change from economics to diversity. And now when I try cases, you have the Norwegian males, you have the immigrants, you have the African Americans, you have different economic and social differences. Now you have to focus that communication so everybody will understand differently, but come to the same conclusion. And that's a very difficult thing. So as part of attorneys, I think we're more cultural anthropologists. What to say, what not to say, how to say it. I mean, right now, the dog whistle term is Me Too. Is Me Too. How do you say things that people understand that is not offensive? And quite frankly, my wife has helped me with this. She's an attorney in Mexico. Is we live in a very sexist society, and we make mistakes in those communications. So when you make those mistakes, how do you deal with it? How do you encompass that into whatever you're trying the case to get everyone to understand?
I think we're going to see that situational awareness and intellectual agility when you start to talk about the cases and how you chose in a very intentional way to try these different cases.
Absolutely.
I wanted you to share with us as well kind of your observations regarding the current state of the law field, which has historically been white and male.
Sure.
What are you seeing right now in law programs, both in educational programs and then in practices in Minnesota in terms of demographics?
Yeah, the legal industry is failing. I don't know if many of you have hired attorneys. And the first thing is when you hire attorneys, I see and I've heard so many clients that walk away and say the last guy that I represented or the last person I represented didn't listen to me. They didn't pay attention to my needs. They didn't understand. I had to pay for this person to take my case in a direction that ultimately didn't work for me. And that's very discouraging. Because I say that any case that goes through the legal system is really a reflection of society. And I think the 4 cases that we'll talk about, I'll pinpoint how those are definitely the reflection of the state of our society. But even further, what we found is I think there is maybe 40,000 attorneys in Minnesota licensed in practice. And of those attorneys that work for large law firms, when you talk to African American males, there are definitely less than 10, no more than probably 5 or 6 that are partners at large law firms. That's concerning, especially when you try cases with a more diverse jury now. The world is going into, especially millennials, into a more collaborative atmosphere where these voices have to work in unison. Not to mention, I think women have made strides with regard to law school enrollment. I think that's up to 50%. However, women aren't partners. They're not managing law firms. And that's problematic because that doesn't reflect the clients that are coming in through many law firms' door. Absolutely.
Well, let's get into the cases because I know that's why you're here. So we're gonna start out with a bang. New York versus R. Kelly.
Yeah.
So how we're going to approach this is Lee will summarize each of the cases, and then we'll kind of get into some of that cultural anthropology work,
Sure.
really, and what it says about society at large.
Absolutely, and please ask questions as we're talking, because I think one of the discussions that Dominique and Peggy and I have is that these discussions that we're having at the Commons, these UnCommon discussions, are really supposed to get the community to talk about issues that are affecting us. The state versus R. Kelly, and this is the R. Kelly, the individual who several years ago, about 20 years ago, was alleged to have sexual relations with a minor. The minor was on videotape. The videotape hit the press. It goes to a Chicago jurisdiction. He hires high-priced lawyers that delayed the case for years, for absolutely years. And when I say a minor, we had a 14-year-old girl whose voice was completely ignored in this. And there was no, I got to be careful of the words I choose because he was acquitted, and I'll talk about that. But there was no mistake that there was a minor on the videotape. What happened was, and the reason why he was acquitted, was the minor never came forth. Everyone knew who the minor was. They knew who she was associated with. They knew where she lived. But because the family was eventually paid off, this just kind of ran its course because of a lot of legal maneuvering between his attorneys of kind of pushing it back year after year, year after year. The United States, we Americans, got desensitized to these voices. We really did. We just got desensitized. In the process, R. Kelly created these really great songs. I Believe I Can Fly. And all our kids' music. They were singing at black churches, they were singing at white churches, they were everywhere. And one thing that we don't do very well is we don't hold individuals accountable that are successful financially. We basically give them a pass. And I'll even divide this up in what I thought was a fundamental flaw with the black community. Number one, the black community held him on a pedestal because he was the one that made a lot of money and he made it. So why should we take this guy, because the system has been historically not good for us, why would we take this guy off the pedestal? So they supported him despite the fact of what he did. And so he got a pass in the black community. That wasn't the only community that gave him a pass because these musicians, Celine Dion, I can go on, who sang duets with him. Even with these allegations, nobody gave a pause. And in the meantime, R. Kelly continued his bad behavior with other women. And so the allegations that I'm working on now is one of my clients who was with Mr. Kelly during this time, and others, they're re-engaging these allegations of 20 years. Some of the allegations in the state of New York. So there's several actions. There's one in Chicago. There's one in New York. There's one in Louisiana, and there's one in California. And what these accusations are, in particular in New York, is the Mann Act. And the Mann Act is probably more familiar with Joe Johnson, where you would bring a woman across state lines for a moral purpose. And so it's an old statute on the books. But this is what Mr. Kelly did. He had women on the bus, and each stop he would make them do very despicable and very controlling sexual acts against their will. Some of them were locked in rooms. Some of them were not allowed to leave, and the allegations go on and on. I mean, if anybody wants to look at the complaint, I would encourage you to look at the complaint because we need to know what's going on in our society. We need to hold individuals like Mr. Kelly accountable. I do think that the state of New York is going to have enough evidence to move forward. One of my clients is going to testify through her experiences. But this is one of the cases that, going back to the state of our country, the state of our learning process in a sense where many cases where you have allegations of sexual misconduct do not get appropriately investigated depending on who the person is. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah, you spoke about this historical silencing of female voices, and what's particularly disturbing to me about that case is the minors, right, who were involved. What do you think, was there something unique about that cultural moment that allowed the victims to finally see their day in court?
Yeah, and it's it was the momentum, quite frankly, not just with the Me Too. I think the momentum started in 1970, with the women's movement, with the voting rights, with the consciousness to get more women into professional environments where they're making decisions and say, look, this is something that invades my sensitivity, and I want to investigate this. We're not going to have this. I have children. Because if you have kind of a monolithic community that is making all the decisions on one particular topic, things go ignored, and that's unfortunate. And so when you take the 1970s, and I don't know if you watched the documentary with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, fantastic documentary, and the things that she did to abolish these barriers for women. I mean, this is the reason why R. Kelly is getting his day in court. And unfortunately, it took so long of bad behavior. I mean, 20 years from the first allegation to now that we're dealing with it. And if I'm correct, there are 27 women that are part of that time span. They have the same stories that are part of the now testimony against him, unfortunately. Absolutely, jump in.
So you're saying women, but at the time that these assaults happened, were they minors?
Not all of them.
Okay.
Not all of them. It's
Repeat the question just because we're recording.
Yeah, at the time when these incidents happened, were all the individuals minors, and they were not. Some of them were women, some of them were minors, and so I'm doing the general term. But yeah, that's a very good distinction, because when you add the minor in, I mean that should add an extra layer of concern, which unfortunately it didn't for our American society.
So I watched the documentary.
Yep.
Kelly,
Yep, the surviving R. Kelly.
and was blown away that there's not enough evidence to have already moved forward.
Right.
And I would echo the comment that as long as we term 14-year-olds women, we are doing them a disservice.
Sure.
That they are little girls.
Yep.
So with that documentary, how does that play into the evidence and the process and the length of time this is taking?
So and I have to divide it in several, because the documentary took certain incidents, in Chicago. It took certain young ladies and women with a different age several years ago. So you have statute of limitation issues that are there. This new case in New York is dealing with newer allegations. And so many of the young ladies who are underage and many of the women who are above age were not part of the documentary. Yeah, little girls. Well, but even then, these are terms of art that use are in the legal setting, and it's unfortunate that we are putting labels on everything, because this is bad behavior. No matter what age, no matter what, this is just bad behavior that should not have been ignored, and it has been. So putting context to your question with the documentary, many of those cases that you saw in the documentary are not going to be retried. Because he was acquitted for one of them that they talked about quite a bit. And once you get acquitted, double jeopardy goes in effect, and unfortunately, he's going to be absolved on that. Yeah.
So other than kind of building critical mass, right, when we think about the Me Too movement, and I'm glad that you traced kind of the historical roots of that, right, and the importance of us all speaking in support of youth, of little girls, and of women who come forward. What are some things, that we can do, because kind of the forward-thinking part of tonight is making our society better for the youth in our community and across the nation. What are things that we can do in terms of laws? So you mentioned, that there were kind of some legal reasons or loopholes that allowed him to be acquitted on some of these cases. Are there kind of some clear advocacy pathways that you can point to?
Yeah, it's very interesting. There are a couple of organizations in town here. Tubman Center is what I've worked for, or worked with from a pro bono standpoint. Many other organizations are underfunded, quite frankly. They're not getting the lawyers that have the experience, that are bulldogs, that they have the resources to help individuals. So that's number one, is really just pick, if this really means something to you, and this is something that you really want to effectuate change, you got to roll up your sleeves and be active. Because quite frankly, and here's my offensive moment, we do a lot of talking. We do a lot of talking. We do a lot of advocacy. We give a lot of opinions, but we don't do. We just don't do. And that's the first thing we have to do. The second thing is that we really have to engage in conversations with two attitudes. One, to participate with our opinions candidly, unabashed, unapologetic. But two, we also have to listen. Because there are many stories that are created that led many individuals to this situation. So one of the stories is many of the individuals who are sometimes the perpetrators have been sexually abused themselves. And so we have to start early, teaching our kids, being parents and adults to our kids. Somewhere along the line, adults have ignored the cries of these kids, all of them, and nobody wins. This is not a situation where anyone wins, because it's so easy for any one of us, including myself, to sit here and talk about this, but we don't live with the scars personally, and we have to recognize that.
Were there any other questions at this point? We're kind of at the point where we're going to move on to the next case, but if it feels natural to ask a question now, I would encourage that.
Yeah, and we can always go back.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to the Go for 10.
Yeah.
Do you want to summarize it?
Yeah,
for us
I can
first?
summarize that. I will start this as one of the, and my wife knows, this was one of the cases that I probably didn't want to practice law anymore. Almost quit. It was Go for 10. We saw it on the news with regard to the allegations of 10 black African-American football players who were accused of sexual misconduct with a white female. I took this case. I'm a former Gopher. I took this case after a phone call. People who know me as a trial attorney, and I've been on several sides. I don't pick a side because I don't think that's giving justice. What my job is as an attorney is to be honest, be candid with my client, and be ethical at all times. And unfortunately, I can't say that my other colleagues do that in the same. This was a situation where when I started diving into the facts, we learned that 3 of the individuals that were accused were not in the state of Minnesota at the time. So they were falsely identified. We also learned that the information in the report that was provided to the public was not leaked. That was leaked to the public was not accurate to a lot of guys. And that was very concerning because race was a very fundamental issue. My wife knows, you go and you kind of sit in a corner, you take a couple of deep breaths, but I've never had more death threats in a case more than anything. And at the same time, I'm thinking that we have these young people that are involved in this really not understandable circumstance. And I say not understandable circumstance because how does anybody come out of the other end the same way? You don't. You don't come out on the other end the same way. And so I didn't understand it. The entities involved didn't understand it. The young people didn't understand it. And here I am kind of thrusted as one of the leaders, of helping these individuals get through. And there's been many times where I said, can we all just sit down and just talk? Just talk. But by that time, everybody had their positions, and there were protests, there were, I was getting pictures of lynchings and, things like that. And it got into discussions that really weren't about the topic at hand, unfortunately. And that was kind of sad for me. It was kind of even more than sad. It was a reflection of where we are. If we're dealing with sexual misconduct and we're dealing with race and we're dealing with, athletes and we're dealing with non-athletes and we're dealing with the press and everybody has their position and everybody is firmly stated in their position, where's the common ground? And quite frankly, nobody was willing to get there. And that was probably most disturbing of it all, because if nobody's willing to find the common ground to make sure history doesn't repeat itself, it in fact, good attorneys, I think, deal with things that will definitely happen. I know the sun's going to come up tomorrow. And so one thing that I do know, if we're not talking and we're not going in the same direction, we are doomed to repeat history. That's one thing I do know. And quite frankly, unfortunately, because nobody talked, it will be repeated. It will be repeated. And that was the one case that still is kind of a cloud over there. So.
What are the topics you would need to be talking about that didn't happen?
That we need to talk about? Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, the one topic, we have 3 kids, and this whole social media issue, and I'm 43, so I'm gonna sound like a very old person. I think my kids are probably gonna underscore that. But what is not talking about is the music we're listening to, the type of language that we use to each other, with insensitivity, hey bitch, or things like that, the N-word. Should not happen with no pause. I mean, and that's what's happening. And we let our society get that way, quite frankly. And I think that's an adult problem. The second thing is we're not teaching our young men to be gentlemen, and we're not teaching our young ladies to be ladies, and how to socially interact with each other. I grew up in Texas where we were taught in schools when a young lady stands up, we stand up. When she's going to bed, you stand up. You put your napkin in your lap. And this was just good behavior. And it wasn't just good behavior of kind of being disciplined. It was just kind of showing respect for our fellow person. And we've lost that, quite frankly. We've ignored it. We don't do it. And I'll admit, we're even to blame in our household that we don't have dinners at the dinner table every night. And those are things that we have to get back to in our society, and that takes some work. But those discussions even more, kids are being with the social media communication. If you send naked pictures to another kid, kids are going to prison for child pornography these days. It happened in Mankato. Something very simple that can destroy your life. And even as adults, we're so punitive, when something like that happens, versus sitting the kid down and saying, look, this is, let me understand why you thought it was appropriate to send this very intimate, private message, text messaging to each other. These you're an English professor. I mean, these very cryptic, I go here without emotion, and it's very fast communication. And we're not able to have, conversations one-on-one. We're also kind of too sensitive too. It's a pendulum swing. We're too sensitive in the sense that I can't ask you, why do you feel that way? Without somebody getting ultra offended to where we can kind of iron out and try to find some common ground. And that's what's great about the community, is that we can learn from each other to make each other better.
When you were describing the case to me the other day, what stood out for me is the multiple power structures that were at play in that case,
Yeah.
right? So you have the university power structure, you have what happened, the incident itself, right? You have the media playing into all of this. And I want to talk about the media and how the media shapes cases, but I kind of wanted to save it for the Tyga case.
Oh, sure.
But we can talk about it here as well. I guess what I'm getting at is, can you talk about power and how that played out in this particular case?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, quite frankly, and I'll be very candid, I think these major organizations really disturbed due process. And that, as a lawyer, is the sacred ground. No matter what happened, you have to have the ability where people feel comfortable, where they have their voice. We hear that from both sides. And, whether you're the alleged perpetrator or you're the victim, or even if you're the plaintiff or the defendant, everybody says, I want to have my voice uninterrupted, fairly given. And so when higher ups at the institution made conclusions with regard to guilt before we even had the administrative hearing, it's impossible to have a fair hearing. And that's not just for the perpetrators, alleged perpetrators. That's for the young lady too, or the young man. And unfortunately, I learned some very disturbing things on how universities collectively, overall, deal with these Title IX, and it needs to be changed as a lawyer. Number one, the investigator who talks to the individuals that are involved also is the one who trains the individuals. So when let me back up. When you have a panelist of 2 students and 1 professor, that basically concludes at the university process whether you're responsible or not responsible. And it has significant consequences. One of the consequences is you get expelled. And this is a situation where Mike Freeman, in this particular case, has denied to charge the crime, alleged crime, twice. He declined it twice. For reasons that, if you ask me, I can tell you why. But when you have the 2 individuals and the professor there, they go through a training, and that training is before the investigator that is testifying at the case. So it's as if you guys come to me and I train these 3 gentlemen in the front row of what they need to look for in evidence, and then when a case actually comes about, I'm the one testifying because I found this evidence. Why wouldn't they vote for me? They know me. They're connected to me. I mean, so that was one thing that I found very disturbing in the process. People don't know that when we did this arbitration, it was at 3 o'clock in the morning. Why would you have an arbitration 3 o'clock in the morning? We were representing 10 individuals. They had 3 hours to present their case collectively. The other side had 3 hours for them. So one person had 3 hours to present their case. They had to divide the 3 hours to present their case. And when that got disturbed, it was the power forces, because it became a PR issue for institutions. And that's where it was fundamentally unsound and that needs to be fixed, this Title IX. I don't know why, if anybody's listening, because this is recorded, hire outside individuals, professionals, to make sure that the process is fair.
I'm curious why Mike Freeman declined to try the cases. Sorry,
No.
Alex. I just had to jump in there with that.
No, absolutely. There was an admission, number one, where he didn't do it. So the first time the Minnesota police, Minneapolis police took, I think it was close to 2 months in investigating. They decided to give it Mike Freeman. There was videotape that was taken that showed evidence that it was consensual. There was also, was not talked about, another witness who was a white female that was also in the complex at that time that the report didn't show. She existed. And her testimony was pretty powerful in favor of the 10 guys, so that was another reason. So when the report came out, the university said, see, we found this. The Minneapolis police, you didn't find this. We found this. So do it again. And Mike Freeman decided not to charge it again. Also, there was a moment, and I'm going to be very candid of what happened when the boycott happened. Everybody knows about the boycott. It was very public. There was an offer given to one of the students that if he would agree to the contents in the documents, that he would be unsuspended and he could play, and the other 9 would do their faith. His mother was in town, and she told him one statement I'll never forget. She said, "Boy, if what's in that document happened, you better tell the truth. If in that document didn't happen, you better tell the truth either way. Even if the consequences don't go your way, you better tell the truth." And he looked at his mom, knowing that he potentially can be suspended, knowing that he could probably play in the bowl game at that time. He told the truth. He said, "That's not what we told him." Many of the kids who were brought into the investigation didn't even know they were being investigated. They weren't told. So there's a law, kind of like employment, there's called a Teagan warning. So if you know you're being investigated for something, you have to let them know so you can get an attorney and all that kind of stuff. That didn't happen in this situation. And the investigator was a Harvard licensed attorney who was conducting this. And the statements that was written in the report were not recorded. So it was a he said versus she said situation, and that was very disturbing. Yeah.
I'm just curious why the 10 men were tried as a group instead of individually.
I was too. I thought that was a flaw in due process. And they were tried as a group despite our many objections. Yeah, I thought that was a flaw in due process. Interestingly, many of those young men that were accused are going to be playing tomorrow in the Penn State game, or Saturday in the Penn State game.
Any other questions on that case?
Oh, thank you, babe. Thank you.
That's better.
probably better.
That's way better.
But most importantly, I mean, I still, regardless of the accusations, regardless of what side you stand on, are really important. They're really important. They're so important that, we should, as a community, really, our schools, our companies, our universities, say, we are going to handle this to make sure that when these heinous acts do happen, that people are going to get through due process. And then when, there's incidents that there's allegations of misconduct that didn't happen, that the person's going to get due process. It was interesting when we did the arbitration, I made the statement that this was the anniversary of Emmett Till. who was a young black kid who was killed for whistling at a white woman inappropriately in Texas. And one of the things that, bring it in context, and this is where race comes involved, the mothers of these black boys said, my biggest fear was this, of sending my black son to college. This was my biggest fear. And so, I think, we as society really have to change the behavior, because regardless of the fact, there were, and I was very, very candid, even with my own clients, that, there are consequences. Even if you didn't do anything wrong, there are consequences to your behavior. We have to teach our sons to open doors again. We have to teach our sons to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and yes, sir, and no, sir. We have to teach our kids that, because if we don't have that discipline, there's this lack of consciousness for just being a good person to the person that we're in front of. Whether it be male or female or whatever. There's a lack of consciousness, so we have to start teaching our kids that at home.
All right, moving on to the rapper Tyga.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a really interesting case that gets at issues of gender, of privacy, and then, as I mentioned earlier, how the media can really influence and shape a case. And then I think there are a lot of interesting cultural anthropology moments in this one as well. So
Yeah.
I'm
This was
excited.
an interesting one. I mean, Hollywood's Hollywood. You never know what you're going to get. I guess it's like a box of chocolates with Forrest Gump. I remember getting a call early in the morning from a client that said, I need you. TMZ is going to run this article. At the time, I had no idea who Tyga was. I don't even know if you guys do. But Tyga is a misogynist rapper. His songs are probably not songs that you would have your kids listen to or should, but he makes money doing it. And he was accused of having a sexual relationship with a transgender model. Okay? Now, misogynist rapper, transgender model, money. And this was coming out in TMZ. So I get called on these cases to kind of deal with damage control and communication. During that time, my client was dating Kylie Jenner. Also during that time, her father was transitioning to Caitlyn Jenner. Also during that time, the Supreme Court was dealing with whether or not they should vote on same-sex marriage. All this was happening in this kind of perfect storm. And so how do you get this allegation of this transsexual relationship, which, again, there's nothing wrong with that. But for my client's career, that was an issue. And also, it was one of those issues that the story started popping up, and I needed it to stop. Our society was kind of making a defining moment at that time with regard to same-sex marriage. And when the allegations came out, it was basically this illicit penis picture that this individual said that she received from my client. And she called a couple of tabloids and she said, this is what it is, and trying to find the 15 seconds of fame. My client was caught up in it. So I had to use the media in an effective way where we can get more people on my client's side so they wouldn't engage in the media anymore. And that was very hard. And so I started to think about what are the issues here. Number one, I have a misogynist rapper. Number two, we're in this time period where we're starting to have the public discussion on LGBT community, which was long overdue. Number three, my client was so close to home on all three of those issues. I don't know how you got the trifecta, but you did. So I worked with TMZ to do an article. And in the article, we basically shamed the individual who put the topic of the penis pic that went out, that how dare they use a transsexual relationship with a heterosexual man as a punchline, and we're not going to tolerate it. And this was bad behavior, this was extortion, and they need to stop, especially when our country, and this was almost the quote, that our country is having the positive discussion with LGBT inequality in that. Next thing you know, I'm getting calls from individuals from the LGBT community saying, thank you, that you didn't, just come out and deny it and say it's weird and blah, blah, blah. Thank you. We're going to support you. We're a fan of Tyga. We're going to do this. Guess what? No more articles. So, I think that's part of my job as an attorney, is to effectuate this communication that is what society is going through at that time for the betterment of my client. And it also was a kind of a learning experience for me as well, in a sense, because I never had, this was the first case where I had to be conscious of the LGBT community and sensitivities that are what I would call dog whistle conversations or dog whistle words that would be an interest of that community. And doing so effectively was very good. And quite frankly, I've gotten many cases passed outside of this one, kind of similar issues and topics. But the conversation was interesting because my client was able to navigate through that and be who he was. Didn't offend a community that they were using to extort him for money. And that was the issue. They were extorting him for money. They wanted him to pay money, or otherwise they wouldn't continue with that type of content.
I think it was a really interesting choice that you made to, first of all, just affirm transgender individuals, right? Saying that there is nothing shameful about having
Absolutely.
a relationship with a transgender person. And so that ethically was a really interesting choice you made. I'm wondering, because you mentioned that you were kind of growing in your own understanding of these issues, did you have any advisors as you were going through this? I mean, these are complex things to...
I wish I had. Unfortunately, I didn't. My wife is probably my best advisor. She doesn't know it, but she is. I always run things past her. But it was my own learning process too. And what I eventually saw is that here is this influencer, my client. And it would have been a knee-jerk reaction, and it would have been the wrong knee-jerk reaction to deny it in a way that we're saying, ugh, But because we didn't do it, and we kind of stayed very consistent to the topic that it wasn't my picture, but how dare you use this? He became somewhat I wouldn't put him on a pedestal, but he got a lot of fans because they said thank you for not using that defense of that we're not human, that we don't exist, that we shouldn't be a part of the conversation. We were made the conversation. We're part of the conversation, and thank you for supporting us. And it was a benefit to him. I think it was a benefit for me as far as learning how to deal with that. But also, it's part of that conversation that everybody's included too. Yeah.
Has he changed his misogynist lyrics?
Unfortunately, no. No. Unfortunately.
It just seems to me that the thing you did that no one's doing presently is that you didn't deny it.
Right.
And you didn't deny it, and you go, oh, no, that's not me, and, I just think all this denial that goes on right now, that I didn't do anything wrong, no, that's not me, that's why the story died.
Also think, no, I think you're absolutely
No,
right.
you said it wasn't him. No.
No,
it's not
the
his.
photo, but we didn't deny what we came out and said. If a relationship did happen, is none of your business, and don't use it as a punchline. That's what we did. And that's something that, I think we've all been in that situation where we asked our friend, like, hey, something happened. Why didn't you defend me? It's kind of the same thing. I mean, we live in these communities where, it's hard enough to coexist without stepping on any other's toes, but it's also hard to coexist and know that you're not being supported by somebody. And then on top of that, it's hard to coexist that you're not being supported by somebody who you want to, that it means something. Like for me, it means something if a person who is not African American said, you know what, yeah, Lee, because of the color of his skin, has had these type of issues in his career. Or a man to come in to a woman and say, you know what, that's not right. We're not going to the strip club. We're going over here. That means a lot. And we need to be able to come out and support each other, even when it's not our cause. Like the whole dog whistle, there's some things that are dog whistles for me that are very important, and different from you that are very important. But we need to learn how to erase those dog whistles, that what is important to you, I need to be sensitive to it. I think I was explaining to Jen that we got on topic of Black Lives Matter. And I have my own personal feelings about, what do I support with that term. But one thing that always was discouraging to me is when, Black Lives Matter phrase came about, somebody says, well, all lives matter. I'm like, you're not listening. If I went into the doctor and I said, my right knee hurts, and the doctor says, what about your neck? How does the neck? Well, my neck is fine. I massage it and, I give it attention. And I said, but my knee really hurts. And he says, but what about your ankle? That matters too. And it's kind of the same situation, like my knee needs attention and I'm begging for you to just give me this attention. And it's not Black Lives Matter, it's gender equity, it's everything. Like just the discussion of saying, I don't understand, I don't get it, but I'm going to take the time to be sensitive to your concerns. That means a lot, because hopefully in that sensitivity, that discussion leads into action, and that action leads into change, and that change makes us a better place.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at how power functions as well, right? Who has power in a particular moment?
Absolutely.
And how do we recognize that humanity in each other and still keep in mind the various power structures that are at play? So,
that's right.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Kylie and Caitlyn Jenner, and so that provides kind of a good personal transition into the last case that we're going to talk about.
The one that hits home.
Yes.
Literally.
Is the Chris Humphreys divorce case.
Yeah. So that was my first family law case I've ever done in my life. Very interesting. I was, I represented, yes, I got thrown in the fire. And boy, did I learn. Chris Humphreys was a client, good friend, who I handled NBA contracts, you name it. He gets introduced to this very well-known brunette who basically changed his world in more ways than one. He was introduced to her, Kim, by a co-teammate who knew her. And during that time, I've been giving you guys some inside scoop. During that time, the family was calling around to teams in New York, finding somebody to date Kim on the show. So they called sports teams. They called the New York Knicks. They called other teams. At that time, we were negotiating Chris's contract with the Brooklyn Nets. There were a couple of athletes that turned them down because they were starting the show. Kim and her sister, I forgot her sister's name, the oldest one. No, not Chloe, the oldest one.
Help us, Kardashian
Courtney.
fans.
Kim and Courtney take New York. Kim and Courtney take New York. I know somebody watches that stuff. So Kim and Courtney take New York, and so they're trying to find an athlete in that area. And so, lo and behold, she gets interested, gets connected to Chris. They had a very quick and fast relationship. He proposed. I was at the wedding, so you can ask me questions about the wedding.
Oh, we will.
Yes, please do. 72 days later, Chris calls me. I'll never forget this day. I was coming back from LA. He calls me. He said, "I just learned that I'm getting divorced on the radio." And I said, "You never knew before then?" He said, "No." And so I said, "Okay, what do you want to do?" His words to me was, "I love my wife. I want to stay married." That was his words. I'll never forget that. And so, now I practice more family law. And one of the strategies in family law is to slow the process down, to hope that the other person would change their mind. I don't know if it's a good strategy, but that's a strategy that many lawyers implement. So we tried to slow the process down. Didn't work. Chris was everywhere. I mean, everywhere. We could not escape. It was on Wendy. It was on The View. It was on E! News. And my name was coming up. Who is this attorney from Minneapolis? And, what business does he have in California? He's going to get destroyed in court. My Southern grandmother says one thing. She says, "Son, you're well balanced because you got a chip on both shoulders." So, that was a mistake they made. But so they were. It was just everywhere. And put yourself in Chris's shoes, where he's now the butt of a lot of jokes of 72 days. And he's not used to that type of attention. He was just a basketball player, and people were making fun of him. He was going to games getting booed. And psychologically, that really affects you. Not only does it affect you from your persona of being a celebrity, but think about just going home at night and being by yourself and having to, kind of make heads or tails of this. It's very difficult. So Chris comes to me, and after the discussions with Kim, and he didn't work out where they were not getting married, he said, "What should we do?" And I looked at him, and I remember saying, "I don't know, but let me figure it out." So I started researching the defenses that you can make, and we basically responded with a fraud claim. So very similar that if you get married if somebody didn't have the proper paperwork, or they married for a contract and not for love, we basically instituted a fraud claim. Then what happened? The pressure went up with the Kardashian family, because Vera Wang, which was the dress that she made and that she wore, they started losing sales. Other people were saying, "Hey, if Mr. Hutton is successful, I'm going to ask for my money back." So they raised close to $20 million for the wedding. That's a lot of money. And so during that time, they're separated, obviously. Kim Kardashian gets pregnant by Kanye West. I'm taking her deposition while she's pregnant with North, her first child. In California, there's a stupid statute. I don't know why they have it, but in California, if a woman is pregnant, the father or the husband is automatically assumed to be the father. No matter who it is, no matter what the DNA says, if you're still married and you go to the hospital, that birth certificate will bear Chris Humphrey's name. Oh, they couldn't have that. And so, of course, I was able to say, well, if you don't want that, then, give us what we want. And quite frankly, at that time, we didn't know what we wanted. We really didn't know. I mean, how do you put back, the love? How do you reverse the time? How do you reverse the pain? Through that process, I started going through discovery. And one of the discovery we asked for was the storyboards. And this will shock you, because it shocked me when I found out. We were able to find evidence that the company and the production studio storyboarded the divorce before Chris knew about it. It literally was part of the plan, unfortunately. That was, in my opinion, very strong evidence. We ultimately reached a settlement. We were able to get the ring back, which we sold on Christie's auction for $750,000. And yeah.
That's what mine cost too.
Yes. Yes. Well, somebody bought it. I think somebody from Minnesota bought it. You're right. So it was, this was an interesting case because it taught me about social media and marketing. It really did. How can you use cases to win your trial? And I can tell you the Kardashians did it better than anybody I've ever been. I mean, every day they were like, Mr. Hutton's a liar. What did I lie about? I mean, and I can tell you, there's a couple of people you don't mess with. Beyonce, Taylor Swift, and Kim Kardashian, because their fans will go after you. And they did. And they were relentless of doing it. But, this was a case that, matters of the heart, and time would pass. And, Chris is doing very well. And I hope, Miss Kardashian is doing well. She's married with Kanye, and she has 4 kids now. Chris is still single, so if anybody's looking. So
what do you think this case says about kind of our cultural obsession with celebrity and how that can derail lives?
Yeah, it was very interesting because here you have just 2 people who got married, which happens every day, in our society. But this particular marriage was televised. This particular marriage was, and this is not people like, I remember growing up, my mother watched the wedding of Princess Diana. That was very popular. This is not those 2, not even close. But it was everywhere, and the money that was being generated, and everything was for free, and it was capitalist. And I think in that, as a society, we forgot what the definition of love was. Even the people viewing it, because when you view it, that was not love. That was not, 2 people, getting married in the eyes of God. And actually, the pastor who did the ceremony was from Minnesota. And I know him very well. And if anybody would talk to him, I mean, he is fundamentally within the faith of 2 people, kind of merging themselves together. I don't know if you know Pastor Joel, if anybody knows him. He's a great guy, and so, this social media fame and to be noticed and recognized, it really had an impact on people other than just these 2, quite frankly. But we live in a society where, selfies are abundant. We have to deliver our celebrity status, and unfortunately, we think we matter more than we do.
Any questions about the Kardashians? Oh yeah, you were going to tell us about the wedding. We have time.
Oh yeah, I can tell you about the wedding.
Know all these people, but tell us some
So it was televised or advertised to be the who's who. Serena Williams was there. Sugar Ray Leonard was there. Scottie Pippen. Lindsay, Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan. Lindsay Lohan was there. George Lopez. Eva Longoria. And really, that was it. Mai Tai. Yeah, he was there. He was there. And so, the people who didn't matter sat in the balcony. That's where I sat. And then, they had certain celebrities that had to be positioned for the TV that was there. It was in Santa Barbara. Although Earth, Wind, and Fire played, that was actually really cool. They played at the wedding. But they had to pull the plug at 12 o'clock. Yeah.
Noise ordinance in Santa Barbara.
Yeah. It was in this beautiful mansion, where Oprah and some other people lived in Santa Barbara. I mean, it was absolutely beautiful. And then when we left, they gave us, every car you had to valet. So you go to this one parking lot, and then you rode a bus, private bus into the place. Helicopters everywhere, police escorts everywhere. For obvious reason, because of the celebrity status. But when you got back to your car, there was Krispy Kreme donuts So I remember that. I was like, this is fantastic. Krispy Kreme donuts. Yeah. No, it was very interesting, and Chris was in love, and he was very, very happy at that time. And unfortunately, after 72 days, his whole world, came upside down. And I think this is a lesson. I talk to kids, and I think we should talk to our kids about this obsession of trying to feel connected through this celebrity or social status. I can understand if you get paid and this is your job, but there are people who are really compromising their soul for nothing, and our kids are doing it, quite frankly.
So the Kardashians, as far as I know anyway, are famous for just being famous. And so their whole thing is they're an influencer. They're brilliant business people, but they got there because they became influencers because they were really good at social media and whatever else. So, I don't even know that I can form my question, but when you're somebody that the only thing you're famous for is your brand, which is that you're in the news.
Right.
Is everything have to be in the news? Is there any private life for people like that? Is there any real life?
Yeah, it's hard because I think when you get into that type of celebrity, you really don't have a filter between reality and what's not reality. I've been a part of reality shows. I've been on some reality shows, and they're not always unscripted. They're very scripted. It's one of the best business quotes that I've ever heard was from Barnum Bailey. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with what he said. There's a sucker born every minute. And unfortunately, we Americans are suckers to this stuff. We watch it, we consume it, I'll admit sometimes, and my wife reminds me, like, put down your phone. Why is it in your hand? Talk to me, look me in my eye. And so we all have to be better. But, where it comes to our young kids, and going back to, where we need to focus this, is the followers, the cyberbullying, the fact that, there's space outside of this, quote unquote celebrity status that you see, that is not you. I think Kim Kardashian and the family did an amazing job doing it. And quite frankly, they taught me a lot with the case on how to influence the public their way. I think we came out very successful at the end, but it was not without many bruises. And quite frankly, they continued, and Chris Humphries made a lot of money playing basketball afterwards. So I think they both ended up in the place that they were destined to be, despite the fact that they crossed paths. But regardless of that, the lesson learned is that there's still this unfortunate desire to be relevant through this social media and through this celebrity that we really have to be careful with.
When people approach you and ask you to represent their cases, do you vet them, or how do you decipher if they're being honest with you?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's very hard. My wife would tell you I'm super compassionate. I'm the one who cries at movies. So, I'm super compassionate, and a lot of that is just a gut feeling. I think where I really try to be in my foundation, that if a client lies to me, if a client is not honest with the evidence, and if they're trying to do something that I personally don't feel that I can do, I have to divorce them. I have to. And there's been clients that I have, and they've been pissed, and they've, sent me death threats too by not doing it. But I can tell you, for that, I will always sleep at night. I think everybody has, what I try to do with clients, everybody needs a counselor, a conciliary. And my job is to say, look, if you did this, here are the consequences, and I'm going to make sure the system is going to treat you fairly, but you're going to have to own up to the consequences. If you think that you're going to get out of the consequences, if you think you're going to manipulate or lie in court under oath, I'm not the attorney for you. Yeah, and I think the attorneys that don't do that are the ones that eventually get in trouble.
Do you prefer to do criminal cases or civil cases?
Civil. Yeah, civil. I do more civil than anything. But, quite frankly, criminal cases, there is the consequence if you lose, life, liberty, and freedom. Civil cases is money, and that means a lot to some people. If you ever been to a lawsuit, and, it's scary, and, we're not taught at a young age to, Corey, I'll give Corey a shout out. He sells insurance. We're not taught to insure a risk, so if something happens, it's the end of the world. I've had clients come to me literally that say, if we don't win this case, I'm gonna kill myself. What do you do with that? I remember one of the first cases I got Attorney of the Year on. That's what a client told me, and I'm, it's not the statement that you want to hear right before you go to opening statements. But unfortunately, many Americans are, a mistake away, a bad circumstance away from losing it all, and my job is to prevent that the best way I can.
Before we wrap up, can you tell us a little bit about the book you're working on, The Absence of Color?
Yeah, so, that's been a project that always has been in the back of my mind, and I doodle a lot, and I've talked to some literary agents, and they love it. So I was thumbing through just the definition of colors, like yellow is this, and this is the hue of that. And I came into the definition of black. And literally the definition of black was the absence of color. Sounds like my legal industry. When I look to the left and I look to the right, there's nobody that looks like me. And, I struggled with that even today of just not having, and I'll put it in this context, it was interesting. I used to go to this black barber shop in Brooklyn Park, and my barber, who I think was a very intelligent guy, never had any formal education past high school. But he says, I don't envy you. And I'm sitting there with my suit, with my name in the side. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't envy me? He said, I'm glad I'm not you. And he started to explain. He says, I can go to work every day and see somebody that looks like me. You can't. I don't want to be you. And I thought about that for weeks and weeks, and I think we've all been in that situation. I think women have been in that situation of being the only one in the room. And I've been in that situation as a person of color. And so the book is hopefully to identify where the legal industry is lacking. I do some employment conversations as well. And many of your employment law firms, when they come in, they talk about diversity issues. They're monolithic. They're all, Caucasian men. And it shouldn't be that way when you're talking about diversity. And I'll be the first one to tell you, I can't, tell you what it feels like to be a woman or a woman of color in the legal industry. Hopefully we're able to bring people in who have that experience and can have an authentic discussion on that. I can tell you what it means to be a legal professional of color in large law firms. Before I opened my own law firm, I was attorney for 750 attorneys. And out of 750 attorneys, I think 5% were people of color, and of that, 1% were partners. I mean, that's hard, especially when, you have her clicks. I mean, it's kind of funny. Life is kind of like the Real Housewives. Haven't you ever wondered why the Real Housewives? Because who they're with, and this is not intentional. It's not intentional. I think people are good people. I just think we have a failure to really educate ourselves and get out of our boundaries. But when you go to Housewives in New Jersey's, it's all Caucasian women. You go to Atlanta, it's all black women. It is that sphere of friends that they're in. And unfortunately, we haven't grown as a society to say, look, I'm going to make this uncomfortable conversation, introduce myself to somebody who does not look like me, and then after I do that, I'm going to make them, if it connects, my friend, and I'm going to invite them out, and I'm going to invite them over, and they're going to be somebody that sits at my table that I really have conversations with, and we just don't do that.
We'll end on that fantastic reflection / call to action.
Yeah, it's call to action. Yeah, absolutely.
We covered a lot of ground tonight, and I want to thank everyone in this room for holding space for discomfort, because a lot of the topics we covered tonight were fundamentally uncomfortable, and rightfully so, because a lot of the things that happened throughout these cases are indicative of deeper problems in our society. And so I just, it's been an honor to enter into conversation with you tonight, and thank you for sharing your wealth of expertise on these topics.
Thank you.